Atman has a really rich and very, very varied background. It was like he was divinely prepared for the work that he's doing now. He has a background in civil engineering and environmental issues and energy and resource studies. He studied sustainable development and worked in the dock with sustainable development projects that were there. And as some other people who have come to Ananda, he had in mind to start a community, a spiritual community. And then lo and behold, he found one. And I don't know if he'll share about that or not, but in the process visited many other spiritual communities. And at Ananda, he's had a varied background too. He was manager of the meditation retreat and manager of the Expanding Light. And then this is what it seems when you do the subtraction. You've been village manager for 19 years now, is that right?
Yeah, I try not to think about that.
I know, it's just amazing, and it shows how time has gone by when I think about when you took over managing them. But for our benefit, he's had all this experience and sees what it takes to make a community like the one that we aspire to, or similar to the one we aspire to see what makes it work, what the challenges are, what people's questions are when they come to the community and want to know about it, and whether it's for them or not. So we're just really thrilled he could find time in his busy schedule to, although I don't know how busy your schedule is out in New Jersey, maybe that worked to our benefit as well. But we're very glad to have you.
It's been pretty laid back. My dad sleeps a lot, so it's good.
Okay, well, please, we welcome you.
Should we start with a prayer?
Let's do it.
So you can just repeat silently because it doesn't work very well on Zoom with a responsive prayer. So, Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Ahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Guru, Paramahansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, we bow at your feet. Divine Mother, thank you for these divine teachings. Thank you for the opportunities to live in spiritual community. Help us to further this work. Help us to further this vision so that this idea of our great master may spread like wildfire. Be with us. Guide our thoughts and actions, and inspire us to thy vision. Om. Peace. Amen. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you to Ram Murthy for inviting me. It's interesting because just a few weeks before I received the invitation, I had done a very similar thing at the request of a group on the East Coast, that they're very much looking for try to get some land and some community. And I think given the interesting times we live in, that's coming to the forefront for a lot of people. And so it's a good time to look back, and we don't have to start from zero. Swamiji laid a wonderful foundation for us, and Master's inspiration is there. It has been there for many, many years. And, it's time to bring a few more communities into fruition. So it's not necessarily an easy task, but it's one that's certainly doable. And the main thing, before we even start, the main advice I would say is just don't look too far. Just put one foot in front of the other. Keep the vision in mind, but don't get too lost in it, because if you start looking at all the things that have to go into it and how to do it, it can be a daunting task. But Swamiji just said, okay, I'm inspired, we're going to do this, and on it went. And that's how many of the Ananda communities were founded. It just started with a group, and then the doors opened as the intention was there, one foot in front of the other. So it's just really important to hold that intention, hold that vision, and I applaud you all, and I hope I can help in some ways. So we can keep it pretty informal tonight. Ram Murthy's going to steer. He's been sort of in tune with where the group's been, and if if I get off on a tangent that's repetitious or that doesn't seem all that helpful, he'll steer me back, and then we'll try to leave time for questions too. And if there's something that you really need to say right now, I can deal with that too. So we're going to keep it pretty informal, more as a conversation. So as I have thought about communities, and I've talked to a lot of people who are very interested in founding communities, not necessarily Ananda communities, but others, the one thing that Swamiji had in his mind and is first and foremost in all our minds is communities are about people. Communities are not about land. They're not about architecture. They're not about technologies. They're not about how to make heaven on earth. They're how people can come together and work towards a common goal. And in our case, most likely that's going to be the goal of helping each other on the path of self-realization. So it's about the people. I have to tell this story. There was a friend of mine who came to Ananda. We met. He was a graduate student from Mexico. He was at the University of California, Davis, and he was studying community planning. He was very, very interested in making a community. He had land picked out near Acapulco. He had this vision of healing centers and retreats and a very spiritual community. And as part of his thesis at Davis was he designed all this. And he got back to Mexico and there were no people. And helping to create a vision, helping to look for the land, helping to just keep their energy in it. Because if it's done by one or two people, there won't be that buy-in. And Swamiji always worked on the principle of trying to bring people together, bring people along, give them things to do, give them responsibilities, just reunite their energies. Because after land is found, after finances are put together, after you're dealing with the government, it's about people living together and people moving there. So just keep that in mind. And I think you've got a great core group here, and we've been at this for a while, a good leadership in LA, but keep those people and work with a core group, work with people who are in tune with that vision. It doesn't have to be everybody. And one of Swamiji's key principles was always try to work with those that are in tune rather than spending all your time trying to convince someone who's not in tune with your vision. So he wouldn't give a lot of energy to the naysayers, the negative people. He just picked a group of people, which some of them you saw in the last couple of weeks, Asha, Nayaswami Asha, and Nayaswami's Jyotish and Devi. They were the ones who were in tune with what he's doing. That's who he worked with and built that core. So that having been said, there's some fundamental things when you're looking for a community, and you need to say, all right, what is it that's going to hold this community together? And there's a big intentional communities movement out there. And I actually would encourage people to check out some of the resources on the Fellowship of Intentional Communities. I think it's FIC.com. I can send some links, but they have a lot of resources that it's not necessarily spiritual communities. It's a whole gamut of communities, but there's a lot of interesting discussion and resources. They publish Community Magazine, and they have a database of books, and they've done some webinars, and they're a good resource. But what they call it is, what's the value proposition that's going to hold this community together? So what is it that the shared vision, the shared values that are bringing people together? And generally, in Ananda's case, it's a dedication to the path of self-realization, and usually through the accepting Yogananda as a guru, Yogananda's teachings, and through the teachings of Swamiji. Now different Ananda communities have different adherence or different coherence, I guess, with those values, you might say. And there's some communities that have people living in them who love community, who love a spiritual atmosphere, but aren't necessarily as committed to this path. One of the things I have to say is it's made my job incredibly easier to have everybody on the same page at the village. And it wasn't always that way. In the 70s, there was still a lot going on about what's the definition of this community? What are we doing? Are we a village? Should other gurus be involved? Are we a village? Are we an ashram? And Swamiji was very focused in his vision. He said, no, we're doing this for Yogananda. This is one of Yogananda's World Brotherhood colonies. And if you guys want to go a different way with it, that's fine. I'll leave. And there was actually a meeting in the mid 70s. Asha talks about it in her book, where he sort of put it to the head. He said he knew he had the people behind him, but there was that clarification that needed to happen. So in a community, as you're starting, it's very good to have that clarification so that you don't get people coming in with a different expectation. Because if you leave it a little bit vague in the interest of, well, we need to attract energy, especially we need to attract some financial resources. Let's just see how it evolves. I don't think that's a good idea. Ananda at one point had a community in the Sonoma coast called Ocean Song. And this was a piece of land that was owned by somebody else. He invited Ananda to come there and to start a community, but it turned out that the two visions weren't quite in coherence. And it went for quite a number of years. And finally, Swamiji just said, okay, is this going to be an Ananda community, or is this going to go the direction of the landowners? And it turned out it went the other direction. He wasn't willing or ready to give some things up. And so people from Ananda withdrew. But I think there was some disappointment there. I think there was I wasn't a part of that, but from what I heard, it was just, a lot of effort went into that, and it wasn't necessarily clear from the beginning. So it doesn't mean that you have to say, we're going to found something that's all people in a Sevaka monastic order, but to say, okay, what is it that's going to hold us together? And in Ananda, it's always been that search for self-realization, the practice of meditation, the wanting to live a life based on spiritual values. And in the case of the village, it's always been those as espoused by Swamiji and Swami Kriyananda and Paramahansa Yogananda. As I said, in the Palo Alto community, there's people living there who are not devotees of this path, and it's worked out fine. I asked Asha about it, and she said, no, it's been fine. There's we still know who we are, and we're sharing a sense of community with other people. But it's clear that's the focus of the community, and it's clear under what terms other people are participating and what they're doing in there. And again, I haven't lived anywhere else except the village, so I don't really want to speak to that too much. But just clarifying what it is we're trying to do, especially in the very beginning, and to be as precise as possible. Maybe putting down some basic tenets, some basic visions, some basic ideas of conduct. It wouldn't necessarily be rules. You're not trying to make too many rules. They spoil the organization, as what Yogananda said. But you want to have a clarity of what people are coming into, what they know they're gaining, so that there's not that disappointment. The other thing that's good to have pretty clear from the beginning is what kind of a structure are you going to, what kind of an economic structure? How are assets, resources going to be held? And I could say a lot more about this. There's a couple sides of the spectrum on a community. One side is a complete income sharing community where the land and all the assets are owned collectively, and people put resources together. They don't keep their own individual salaries or finances, and all income is shared. Decision making is made on how money is spent as a collective. So some of you may know Cité Écologique is another it's another community in Quebec and New Hampshire. That's the way they run, and we've had some interaction with them. It's also to some extent how Ananda Assisi was founded. There it started around a retreat center, and just for pure economic survival, they weren't really able to pay salaries to people, and everybody just lived and worked and ran the retreat. And they did get a stipend, and they were able to keep individual money, but it was a much more of a collective operation than at the village. Swamiji thought when he founded Ananda Village that what was best suited to the American temperament was where people were in charge of their own finances, that he didn't see that people being obligated to give resources or just share everything was going to work very well. And he had studied a lot of different communities. He had looked at a lot. So when he founded Ananda, everyone took care of their own finances. People were, to the extent that they could, they founded businesses. They worked for Ananda businesses, and people had a salary or had at least a stipend, and were able to, bring money in from the outside, work outside, keep their own finances. He did, however, choose to have all the assets held by a nonprofit. So he's the one who bought the land in the first place. He put up the money for the mortgage. He paid the mortgage for a while, and then it got turned over to the community paying the mortgage. But the land at Ananda Village is all owned by the Ananda Church of Self-Realization of Nevada County. So people put in money and build houses, but none of those houses are owned by individuals. All the land right now is owned by this nonprofit cooperative. And the basis of that cooperative are the life members of the Ananda Sevaka order. They're the voting members of that, but it's all held as a nonprofit. Now, the other communities didn't necessarily do it that way. They had a group of investors that came together, many of whom were from Ananda, some who weren't. Palo Alto was that way. Seattle has since bought back the community from the investors, so it's owned by people in the Seattle community. They have shares of it. It's held as an LLC, a limited liability corporation. And I'll talk a little bit more about some of those possibilities, but it's a very important thing to try to understand, because there's a lot of money on the line. And especially, you guys are in Southern California. I mean, it's not like real estate is easily had and you can just go out and build a bunch of houses. It's had a real estate boom that's been going on for, 50 years, and prices are high, regulations are high. It's a difficult environment. So there's going to be a lot of resources at stake here, and you need to be pretty clear about, for people, how money is put in, how you're buying the land, how you're holding the land, who's making decisions on that, and then how do people get money back out? Because as much as people go in with an intention to say, I'm going to be, this is it, this is my life, I'm going to stay in this community forever, people change, and people come and go. And so if they are owners or part owners of the community, what happens when they're ready to leave? And I'll talk a little bit about the housing pool at the village, and we ran into some of that just even with the housing, but the land was never in question. But it's been, it's some issues with Palo Alto. There's some investors right now who are, they're not Ananda devotees, and it's a source of some interesting discussions right now. Let's leave it at that. So trying to be clear on what that is, how people get in, how people get out. One of the things that happened initially at Ananda Village is, even though the village owned all the land as a nonprofit, housing, people put in money for houses, and that money was something that could get paid back to them, even though they didn't have official title to the land. It was held as a part of a housing pool. And initially, that wasn't all that well codified, because people built houses, they put in their own labor, they sometimes hired other people, sometimes it was sold to another member. And then at that one point, that member wanted to leave. All right, what's the value of the house that is going to come back to him? That's something that we found out somewhat the hard way. It was important to have clarified. Then we sort of had some handshake agreements, and we said, oh yeah, you put this much in, yeah, we'll put it on for this. And well, somebody gets disgruntled, the money that's in that house represents, probably the majority of the resources they have, or certainly a good chunk. If they're leaving the community, they want to be able to get that out. They may look at it as real estate rather than helping a community. And so it's just good to be very clear. And after the late 90s at the village, the housing system was much more codified. We wrote a legal document called the Master Housing Agreement. We'll sign that. It's a legal document that had a vetting by the courts during bankruptcy proceedings. And so it's a document in good standing. It's served as well. It's not perfect, and we need to keep modifying it. Although when they wrote it up, they didn't put in a clause of how to modify it. So we're dealing with that right now. There's still some evolution, but to the extent that you can, be as clear as you can with people's monies and expectations, because people come in often with rose-colored glasses, but I can tell you by experience, sometimes it's time to leave and those rose-colored glasses come off, and they're maybe they're not as harmonious and agreeable as they were to start with. And I don't want to, again, I don't want to give anybody a bad idea of what this might come up against, but to quote to quote Rick Bonine, who was the village manager in Palo Alto, he said, "Yep, communities. There's only one thing that's difficult about communities: people, people, people." So you just have to remember that's what communities are about. But we're not saints yet, and it's not going to be this perfect thing. So putting in some safeguards, some clear legal jurisdictions or legal documents about how money is held, how it comes in, how it goes out, how decisions are made about valuation of assets. Those are all really important things to deal with. And there's lots of different ways to do that. So we can talk some more about some specifics. So those are the main things: value proposition, how do you get in, how do you get out? Okay, so now we're ready to start looking for some land. And you don't necessarily have to solve all those other things first. You can look and get a vision going for some community. So communities are about land or real estate or places to live. And as I said, one of the big issues you're going to face in Southern California is any developer who can suddenly manifest a place for 50, 60, 70, 100 people to live, which is what our community would want to do, can make a fortune, because you can sell houses, and the real estate market in Southern California, I think, is still, through the roof. And so there's a lot of protections and hoops and hurdles that have been put in place to make it hard, or to make it at least developers to be very conscious of what they're doing. And unfortunately, even though we are very well-intentioned, cooperative, communist, spiritual, we're doing a great thing, we have great values, we're still going to be looked at as developers. In the end, what we're trying to do is take a piece of land and make it so a bunch of people can live there, which typically to government says, oh, these people are trying to come into a subdivision, they want to sell property, they want to make money, let's make sure that they comply with all these things. So California has a huge amount of real estate, subdivision, environmental regulations that you have to be able to comply with and jump through. And the closer you are into the nucleus of LA, the harder it's going to be. As you know, I mean, it's just real estate subdivision gone wild down there. So as you move farther out, it's really important what jurisdiction you're in, how they deal with people coming in, wanting to build, wanting to increase population density in a certain place. And it's very important to know what jurisdiction you're looking in. And one of the first things you can do is to look at, there's something called the general plan. So every land jurisdiction in California has to come up with something called a general plan. And generally it has to be updated. This is a state mandate. It has to be updated at least once every 20 years. And in that general plan, it's set out what are our goals for our jurisdiction. So it could be a city, it can be unincorporated rural areas, it can be a county. Our jurisdiction in Ananda Village is Nevada County, but it might be in the Palo Alto community, it's the city of Mountain View that they have to deal with. In Laurelwood, there's a rural, I think there's a rural township there that they deal with. So it's important to know who you're dealing with, because the rules are going to be a little bit different, and the people who are making decisions about what can happen there are going to be a little bit different. So the general plan is this guiding document that says, this is our target population, this is how we see land in our jurisdiction, and each piece of land has a designation in that general plan. And that is something that can be changed, but it has to be done in a fairly rigorous process of going back to the governing body and actually amending the general plan. So the general plan is going to say, okay, this kind of an area is set for light industrial development. This is commercial development. This is single family residential. This is multifamily residential. This is rural. This is rural agricultural land. For example, the farm that they bought down in Half Moon Bay is it's a beautiful piece of land. And you say, well, my God, we could have a community of 150 people here easily. It's got the resources. That land is under severe restrictions that it has to be kept in agriculture. And so, we scoot a little here and scoot a little there, and we have visitors and we have agro-tourism and we have farm workers, but you're never going to be able to build, 20 houses there, 20 single family dwellings, unless you went through a major amendment process. And it's unlikely that the town of the jurisdiction of Half Moon Bay would allow that, because again, the neighbors are there. They like they've all got their piece and they like the protections that are around them. And to suddenly say, yeah, there's going to be 150 people living here, guess what? They're not going to be real in favor of it. And it's going to be a hard thing to do to change the general plan. So there are jurisdictions where the county is looking for development, and you may have a planning commission, or you may have county supervisors or a city council who is very enamored with the idea of a community or co-housing or some kind of a development with the values that we represent. And in this case, you wouldn't want to necessarily go too heavy on, spiritual or yogananda meditation. You'd want to emphasize that we're clustered housing, we're supportive of each other, we're going to have cooperative ownership, and put it in terms that you think they can relate to or that they would resonate with. So the co-housing movement is one to look at. There have been a lot of advances in the last 10 or 15 years in making co-housing developments happen. And in general, the jurisdictions have been open to that. And there have been pieces of land that they've been able to do that and create. Generally, it's a condominium model, or it tends to be somewhat smaller, but there's also rural co-housing. So if you see a piece of land and you say, wow, this could be great, find out what it says in the general plan and how it's zoned. And then look up those things and say, all right, what would that mean that we can do? So at Ananda Village, for example, it's ag land, it's AG, but within that, you're allowed to have, you can have mixed use developments. And way back, we were able to get something called a planned unit development. And we convinced them to say, look, we're going to be a little village. We want to have some commercial. We want to have some light industrial, some offices, a retreat, a school, and residential. And they were able to find a zoning that was allowed in that general plan designation. And we were able to get the zoning to fit what we wanted to do. And in the last time we updated the master plan, which was a process that happened in the last decade, ending in 2017, the stage for that was set back in 1995 when Karen Gamow and Jaya Haleen petitioned the Nevada County supervisors. At the time, they were updating their general plan to say, we'd like to have a greater density here. And it was a big political fight with neighbors, but they were able to get that through. And then that paved the way for us to come in and say, okay, we have the right to build, we have the possibility to build this many houses. Here's how we're going to do it. And we did all the environmental review. So when you're first starting out, though, it's important to say, okay, what could we do with this piece of land? And if you can find somebody on the planning commission or a supervisor or any kind of a connection to that jurisdiction to start having a friendly, open conversation and say, we're interested in having a community. We think it's really important this day and age that people can live together, work together, support each other, maybe be a bulwark against hard economic times. See if you can gain some resonance. If you can get somebody on the planning commission or the supervisors on your side, they can tell you how the best way to present this. So it's not going to be, I can almost guarantee you won't find in the general plan listed, okay, this is ag land, but you can do cooperative spiritual communities. Forget it. It's not going to be, it's not going to be in there. But they might say you could do a cluster development that, preserves agricultural land, that allows for some rural tourism, a retreat business, or you have to speak their language, and you have to look at what it is that's gotten approved recently and what they might be in support of. Now, it's still going to mean probably that you're going to have to go through some kind of a process where you can get that designation. It's very unlikely you're going to find somebody who wants to sell a subdivision. I mean, it's possible. I mean, you could have somebody, but you're going to pay a lot more money for it too. I mean, Michael Gornick, who's been looking for the Polestar community moving from Hawaii, they found some land in Colorado where exactly that had happened. The previous owner, it had been a couple of farms, but he worked with uh, the group in Colorado Springs, I think it was, or I'm not sure anyway, one of a Colorado jurisdiction, who was very anxious to see some kind of a more residential happening, but with the farming happening as well. And so he had actually gotten some permissions to do this, and then had gotten sort of on in his life where he couldn't do it. He was offering it to Michael. So I don't know if that's going to go forward or not, but again, it's finding that, where do we fit, and how can we tweak it, but not too much, and where do we go? Chances are, if you just look for land that says, wow, here's 80 acres, this is great, it's affordable, it's in the right sort of a distance from the center, people could still work, telecommute, whatever. Chances are you're going to have to do, you're going to have to really look at it. It may have an agricultural protection on it. It may have an open space protection on it. It may have a zoning that says you have to have, you can have one dwelling per 20 acres or one dwelling per 40 acres. And to get that changed, you have to work with it. So there's, again, depending on what size the community want, how you want to do it, there's various ways to work with that. I mean, sometimes you look at, okay, what's a dwelling unit? Well, a dwelling unit in Nevada County is a kitchen. So in a kitchen is a installed cooking appliance, a refrigerator, and a sink. But you can build that house as big as you want, as long as you have one kitchen. But then you can also have little wet bars in your guest rooms. And so you could presumably build a house that housed 20 people. Now you have to be careful. There may be some laws about how many unrelated people can live together, because then it becomes a boarding house, and a boarding house is another zoning regulation. And so the best advice is, see if you can get some kind of an ally, either a real estate agent or somebody who knows the area, or better yet, somebody on the planning staff or on the planning commission, who you can have a friendly conversation with and say, look, this is our vision. How can we manifest this here? How can you work with this? What can it do? And they're surprisingly willing to help come up with ideas of way, well, you could call it this, but don't call it this, and don't do this, and see what unfolds. But you want to do that before you buy the land. If you buy land and then you find out, the owner of the land had sold it to you, says, oh, sure, yeah, you can do, yeah, why not build a house here and here and here and here and here. I mean, chances are they may not be up to date on what all the regulations are. So look it up on the county website or go to the county recorders. What's the zoning? What's the general plan jurisdiction? And what is it that you're allowed to do with those two things, the general plan and the zoning? Zoning is easier to change than the general plan. And sometimes the general plan, you can tweak the zoning a little bit. So the next piece of that is, who are the neighbors? Because there's a saying in planning that the neighbors enforce the regulations. And we have found this to be, unfortunately, very true at Ananda Village. So there's always a temptation to kind of push the envelope. And this is once the community was established, oh yeah, we'll just put in another kitchen here, or well, just do this, or we'll just build this without a permit, or we'll just do this. I mean, we had some people in the early days of Ananda who were not very fond of government regulation and didn't see a lot of use in getting permits. And it came back to bite us because at one point you would get somebody who didn't like what Ananda was doing, and they would put in a complaint. And by law, the code compliance division has to go investigate. And so they go and investigate, and they say, yeah, we know this complaint is politically biased and politically motivated, but we have to respond. And yes, you guys are in violation and you have to correct this. And depending on the jurisdiction, it can be, Ananda Village has actually been very lucky. It has been pretty painless for us to correct some of these things after the fact permits and all that. But right now, the county has a code enforcer and a building inspector who is not a lenient guy. And so I think it'd be a lot harder right now. He could come in and say, yeah, this was built without a permit. Okay, you built it 10 years ago. You got to bring it up to the codes now. I want to see what's inside those walls. I want to see what's in the foundation. You got to x-ray them or you got to rip it apart. Was this built to code? You got to retrofit sprinklers. You got to retrofit all this other stuff that's been in there. So, you want to stay on the right side of that. And you also want to stay on the right side of your neighbors, was a point I'm getting to. So when you're trying to build something for the first time and you're looking at a piece of raw land, or maybe even you're looking at a group of houses that have already built there, or something that you're going to convert with this vision, get to know who lives in the neighborhood. What size parcels do they have? What do they do? Have there been any other bigger groups in the neighborhood? Have there been any other changes in the land use in the neighborhood? And what have those people had to say about it? Like, you could find out, yeah, 10 years ago, the same piece of land that somebody's trying to sell you, there was a developer came in, tried to subdivide it, had a huge outcry from all the neighbors, and was politically defeated. And that's how it got sold to this guy who now wants to sell it to you. So do your due diligence, look at the histories of it. And as much as you can, try to see who's around it. Who are the neighbors, and would they be open to you? Would you impact them? If you suddenly have 30 people living there and you've got 20 cars going in and out, how does that affect the road? How does it affect a private road you may share, or how does it affect local resources like groundwater or open space, or so you have to really think about your neighbors too. And if you can get in good with the neighbors, that goes a really long way. And one of the best ways to get in well with the neighbors is to invite them in early and just have an open house, do something for them, put in, I mean, this is maybe a little bit farther down the road, but put in some money to fix the road. I mean, if you can do something that says that it'll benefit them, they're much more likely to support you. If they can get to know you, they know, hey, we're all really nice people. We're not we're not growers, we're not drug addicts, we're not going to have police out here. This isn't a hippie commune. So whatever you can do to establish that, and it's not an easy thing, and you're going to have to just see where it is and what you're doing. And that may even be the point, even if you're looking at a set group of apartments or something like that. Just what's the neighborhood you're in, what's been the experience with these apartments before. People may welcome you in. I mean, when Ananda moved into the apartments in Sacramento and the apartments in Palo Alto, they were affordable to Ananda because the apartments were in really bad shape and they had a really sketchy clientele. And so people were very happy that Ananda was moving in there, and that the neighborhood, definitely improved from that. And a number of the tenants were asked to leave. And anyway, it was sort of a whole story there. But anyway, find out what's going on with the neighbors, with the local political jurisdiction, with the zoning. What you might want to do, the ideal is to find a land use planner who is familiar with the jurisdiction that you're working with, who also has a connection to your Sangha. So that's the ideal, because somebody who professionally knows how to operate in these worlds, how to read the laws, how to do it. I mean, we're at Ananda Village, I was largely self-educated in this. I mean, Jaya Helene passed off some stuff, Karen Gamau helped, but we just kind of worked through it. At some point in the process of updating our master plan, Alex Forrester arrived, who actually had a career as a planner, and he helped immensely. He knew how to approach things. He knew what things were looking for, what they were doing, and he was also willing to volunteer and work for devotees' wages. And so he helped us a tremendous amount of getting through this last master plan in this jurisdiction. So put out the word. If there's somebody, these are generally land use planners, or sometimes they work for an engineering company who does this. They do engineering and land use planning, or land surveying and land use planning. And even if you don't find somebody, it's probably worthwhile to at least do a consultation with some of these people. I mean, they can save you a lot of time. Paying for a few hours of their time, saying, all right, what do you see as a potential for a project here? They'll be frank with you, because they're used to doing this thing. They're used to helping people who want to build, who want to create communities. And again, probably not spiritual communities as uplifting and as great values and as friendly and as harmonious as we are. But again, that's not the lens the counties or the supervisors are going to be looking at you. They're going to be looking at you as, okay, who's trying to come in? What are they trying to build? Are they trying to make money? Are they trying to subvert economic or environmental laws? Are they trying to shaft the neighbors in any way? So you just have to switch lenses. Don't lose your ideals, but make sure you can see things from that different lens, because it'll save you a lot of heartache and trouble. Okay, so what do you look for in a piece of land? And the big thing that I would say is infrastructure, infrastructure, infrastructure. So a lot of people will focus on, okay, what do we build? How do we build it? Is there innovative building we can do? How, could we get, tiny homes? Could we bring stuff on? The building in some ways is a lot more straightforward than providing infrastructure at a place. And so first thing you want to look at, this is California, this is Southern California, is water. What is the water supply? How good is the water supply? If you're hooked into some kind of a purveyed water, a water system, there's a pipe that runs by the property. How much is it going to cost? What can we use? What can we use for irrigation? What can we use for homeowners? If we build more homes, can we get more water allotments? Usually it's sold by a number of meters. Water is a hugely regulated thing in California, especially for water purveyors. At Ananda Village, we're a small public water system that has to wade through more regulations every year. Even though we just started out, we had some springs, we had some wells, and we put in some pipes, but gradually we got big enough, and the state regulations got more and more strict. As you have a Flint, Michigan happen, the EPA makes some one-size-fits-all regulations, and guess what? You have to test your water out there in the San Fernando Valley or the mountains or whatever, just like you would have to in Flint, Michigan, because they made a one-size-fits-all testing. And there's some back and forth with that, but the main thing when you're looking is, what's my water supply? How do I get it? Where is it? If you're going to depend on wells and you're in Southern California, make sure you drill the well, or there's a drilled well there, or it's a contingency. Do not buy the land without a proven water supply. This was a mistake that happened in Pune. In Pune, supposedly, oh yeah, no problem. Yeah, you can get water here and you have water rights in the river. They still don't have water on the Pune land. There's supposedly a pipeline. There's supposedly supposedly water rights. But, again, India is a different story, but they're bringing in water in trucks, and they weren't able to drill a very good well on the land that could support what they wanted to do there, just because of the geology there. And especially in Southern California, it is not at all a certain thing that you can drill a well and get a water supply that's going to support a group of people. So be concerned about that. If there is an existing well there, try to get a copy of the well driller's report. So that's something that they have to file with the county. They should have records of it. If whoever's selling you the land can give you a copy, great. Or if they can tell you, when was this well drilled? When was it last tested? And if it hasn't been any testing, make a contingency on the sale to test it. And typically that's done by doing a pump test, it's called. So there may be a drilled well there with no utilities to it, in which case you'd need to bring out a generator, put a pump in it, and test it. You want to pump it nonstop for at least 24 hours, probably better longer. At the village, to qualify our wells for this water system, we had to do a 10-day pump test. So we pumped our wells 10 days without stopping, and we kept looking at the water level, and we said, okay, where's the water level stable? and we can, we're pumping and pumping and pumping day 8 or 9. Okay, we got to back off a little bit. Here it is. That gives you the yield of the well. And that's what we were able to use to plan on, to say, okay, you can support this much development. We did a whole water projection, that kind of thing. But it's extremely important to test the wells. And typically with a residential well, they'll only pump it for 3 hours. But if you're trying to make it so that you're going to support a bigger development there, you're going to want to pump it longer. And you'll want to have something as a pressure transducer goes down the well that can monitor the water level is. So, because you could be pumping for 3 hours and the water could be dropping that whole time, and you could get it past, where the water bearing fractures are, or where the aquifer is. And again, know the geology where it's coming from. And a hydrologist can help a lot with that. And it's extremely, extremely important in California, though. It makes or breaks development. Do you have water rights? Can we bring in water? How much can we use? Can we get a well here? Can we do agriculture with it? So water. Second thing that's probably one of the more critical ones today is, although this is changing, but it's internet service, believe it or not. So out where we live in the rural area of Ananda Village, there are many people who have very, very poor internet connections. And especially in times of working from home, in lockdown, in all this, they're at a real disadvantage. And when parcels are sold, it's one of the things people want to know. Okay, what kind of internet access is there? How do I get it? Can I get one of the satellites? Is there a good site? If I do one of those satellites, who are the providers? What kind of speeds do they get? What happens when it gets overloaded? Do they throttle it down? Because people, you get some broad promises, and then everybody gets on at 6 o'clock, and next thing you know, you don't even have enough internet to stream anything. By the way, Ananda Village got extremely lucky. Master smiled on us. They actually ran fiber right by the entrance to the community because it was a state project to run it to Downeyville, which is the capital of Sierra City. It's this really puny little county to our east and north. It only has 3,000 people in it, but they decided that they should have good internet, so they ran this cable right by our community. And then 5 years of dealing with bureaucracy and AT&T and back and forth and finding subcontractors, we were finally able to tap into that fiber line. So we have a huge advantage over other people that live around us, that we have a good internet service. And for a community getting started in this day and age, it's pretty critical. Now, Elon Musk may solve everything with his low-level satellites, and you get great reception, but it's going to be important for the economic well-being of the community. It allows people to work from out there. It allows you to stay connected. It allows you to, bring in stuff, to broadcast, order. It's just, I don't have to tell you guys, you're all in the electronic age, but it's something you don't necessarily think about. There may be a phone line there. Okay, if the phone line is there, is the phone company willing to extend DSL? If it extends DSL out here, what kind of service does it get? Maybe there's a cable there, and maybe you can get a cable provider, but find out what it is, because it's an important thing. It's more important than phone service for sure. Phones you can make do with things, but it's getting online, being able to stream, being able to do the things you need to do in this day and age. It's important. Next one down the line, it's a toss-up. Electricity and sewage disposal. Now you might think sewage disposal, that's no big deal, but surprisingly, a county, there are a lot of parcels that are really unbuildable because they can't really dispose of their wastewater. Now, there's ways that you can do it, but it gets very, very costly the poorer your soil is. So the ideal for a rural area, unless you're on a sewer, there's a chance that you're hooked up to a sewer district and you get a connection and you just send it into the pipe and off it goes. You're going to want to know, how many sewer connections can I have? How much is it going to cost? Who raises the prices? How often do they get raised? What's it going to cost us? But believe me, if you have a sewer, it's a good thing. So generally, if you have the connections to be able to do it, most rural parcels try to dispose of sewage on site. And the typical way you do that is it's called a septic field. You put it into a tank, the microbes eat up all the solids, there's water that comes out, and you put it into a trench and it seeps back into the ground. Well, believe it or not all soils are very good for doing that. And it's actually can be a real constraint. You can have really sandy soil where it's too rapid and you'll pollute groundwater and you can't get rid of your sewage that way. You can have really hard clay soils where it won't perk at all. It's called a percolation rate. No water soaks in. You know, you put water out there, it sits in the trench, and you come back 3 days later and it's still sitting in the same trench. So that doesn't work for sewage disposal. So typically you do tests for this. You'll dig the soil. It's called a mantle. You can see what the soil profile is. You may want to get down to a certain layer of the soil. Okay, this is a good layer for absorbing it. This one's too fast. This one's too hard. Okay, let's go here. It means we have to dig a trench that's 6 feet deep, and we'll put our water in there. So ideally, it's just really simple. Gravity feed into a tank and goes into your septic system and it percolates and you never have to worry about it. You don't even have to think about it. That's the ideal. There's lots of ways, systems that have a lot more moving parts. Like the soils may not be good enough and you may have to send it out in a dose or in it's called a pump system or a pressure dose system. And you have to have pumps and you have to have electricity and you have to have backup and you may have to actually import some kind of a media or soil that the stuff can percolate through and the bacteria can eat it up. And again, that's all gets a lot more expensive. I mean, it can easily be $20,000-$30,000 a house to put in just a simple septic system to get rid of it. And, depending on what you're facing, you go from there. There are little, sewage treatment plants you can get these days. There's lots of technology out there, but it can be a full-time job. And chances are, if you're a small community, you don't really want to be running a sewage treatment plant. It can be a hard thing unless you have somebody who's really into it. And again, it tends to be more expensive. So simple is better. Just run into a tank, into the ground. Soils are all good. It all works. It's not going to pollute my well. It's not going to pollute my neighbors. It's not going to go into groundwater. It's all good. Next thing is, of course, electricity. This day and age, electricity is much less of an issue than it used to be, for two reasons. One, if utility powers at the site take it, just say, Haribo, this is fantastic. We got energy from the utility. You can still put in solar. You can still put in backup. You can still put in battery banks. You can still make it work, for more self-reliance and more energy. But even with PG&E, or I guess you guys are Southern California Edison, it's still a good deal with the utilities. It tends to be, if you have to recreate a system from scratch, it can be quite expensive. And what you're going to have to weigh off, though, is if there's no electricity there, do we bring in electricity or do we invest in our own system? And that's where it's gotten a lot more interesting. The utilities do not want to extend power anymore, any of these power lines, and they charge a lot. I mean, it's just we're talking about just for the utility part of it, like $30 a foot. So you can imagine if you have to go, if you have to go 5,000 feet, you're looking at $150,000 right there. If you have to go a mile to extend your line, and that's just the utility part of it. That's not putting in, what the contractor puts in, either as poles or underground or all that stuff. So in that case, you can look and say, all right, what would it take to do our own standalone system? Because that's a big chunk of change that you have to invest. And right now, battery technologies are, on a really good improvement curve. Solar panels are cheaper than they've ever been, and Southern California's got lots of sun. So if there isn't PG&E there, really see what the trade-offs are and whether you might want to put it in. But again, it's going to be something that you probably want to have a good idea that you want to solve before you get out there. And you want to be realistic, because a lot of people have sort of ideals of, I can live on, just a little bit of electricity. And you don't need much, but, do you want a washing machine? Washing machines tend to take a fair amount of electricity compared to just some LED lights or charging your phone. Washing machines, most people are pretty interested in having washing machines. They don't really like hand cranks or things like that. You know, you could fire up a generator, do that, but you know, the other thing is having some backup. You're probably going to want to include some kind of a generator in your system because even in Southern California, there's cloudy days, you know, and to have a battery bank that's going to get you through, you know, a storm of 4 or 5 days, you probably want some kind of a backup. So again, just really pricing out what that system is, how you're going to do it. And again, if you've got the utility there, go with it and then add to that because it's going to be, I mean, you know, my first job at Ananda was up at the Ananda meditation retreat, and they're off the grid up there, as you know, and it was amazing how much time we spent trying to keep our system going, having it limping along, and we had propane refrigerators and we had propane lights, and you know, we had very little electricity at that time, but we had to have we had to have a generator to pump water and a few. I mean, it was I'm somebody who worked in sustainable development and, you know, put solar energy systems out there, but I was amazed at just how much energy it takes sometimes to keep systems going. And they've gotten a lot better. They're a lot more maintenance free, but it's something that you know, is that where somebody has the energy for? Do they want to be doing that? Do they want to be spending their time there? And how much are people willing to modify their lifestyles to if you're on a pure off-grid system? You know, you need to be aware of what you're using, or you need to spend a huge amount of money for the infrastructure, you know, to run a suburban household. Air conditioning is a huge energy draw. Okay, are you going to have air conditioning? You know, it depends where you are. If you're outside the ocean breezes in Southern California, probably going to want to think about air conditioning. Running air conditioning on a solar system is not necessarily an easy thing. You need to have a pretty big solar system. So just be aware of energy consumption. So those are the main ones: the phone, water, sewer, and electricity. Generally, gas, it's pretty easy to get propane. You can cook and heat with propane. Um, you know, there are some alternatives. You can do heat pumps these days are getting a lot better. There's some, you know, you can do geothermal things, use ground for cooling. And there's a lot of really innovative technology out there. But again, you have to be careful of where your energy is going and your resources. And you know, we're trying to get this community off the ground. Do we want to spend you know, a huge amount of money trying to figure out geothermal cooling for our houses right away? You might have the right person to do that, and it's a good thing to do. But you want to look at that. Last piece of the infrastructure is access. So don't underestimate what it takes to maintain a road. If you have a driveway or a shared private road that's a gravel road, you're going to need to put some energy into maintaining it. Okay, how many people share this road? Is there a road association? Does everybody contribute? Or is it like Sage's Road at Ananda Village where they don't have any formal road association? There's a few people who are always fixing the road and always putting in money, and there's others who just don't. They're just freeloading. And then there's Ananda Village who doesn't even charge its neighbors because we're trying to be good neighbors. So, you know, if you're maintaining roads, you know, shared roads, you know, what are the agreements on that? How much does it take? With less rain, there's less wear and tear on the road, but gravel roads will be worn with traffic. The other thing is if you have a gravel road near your house, dust is a huge issue. I mean, finally at Ananda Village, we've gotten the roads near the houses paved, but it took us 25, 30 years to do it. And paving is expensive, but you know, you want to try to site your houses so you don't have a lot of traffic coming right by it. And because dust is an issue. And you know, I go to cities these days and I walk around, I just marvel at the infrastructure. I go, do you know how much that sidewalk costs? Do you know how much it costs to pave this road? Do you know what it took to get all this stuff here? Because we've been trying to do it at the village and it's incredibly expensive. And there's not like government jurisdictions doing it. It's your private land. You're doing it. I mean, asphalt paving can be $3 a square foot. So if you're doing a 20-foot road, 1 foot of road is $60, you know, that's not very far. So it's just be aware of that kind of thing. And who you're sharing with and how it comes into it. And we have gravel roads at the village and meditation retreat, though. You've all gone up there. It's a detriment to that retreat to have to drive down 3 miles of gravel road. People get lost, people freak out, it's dark, it's bumpy, there's potholes all winter. So anyway, it's just something to be aware of. So I think those are the main things about land, infrastructure, the county planning. We've talked about the value propositions, how to get in, how to get off, what's the shared values. I could say a little bit more about how the village has answered some of those questions, but maybe I should take a pause and stop talking so much and see if anybody wants to jump in here with some questions or some clarifications, or if there's a direction that you like me to go in.
Are there any questions right at this point about anything he said so far, or a new direction you'd like him to take a point further?
All right, I can keep going here. So, like I said, I've had the experience more of Ananda Village, and just to give you a little bit of the history, it's we have 700 acres, and we have permission now to build 195 dwelling units. We have about 100 more or less built, so we have a long way we can go. And we have multiple zoning. We have a village center, which has a commercial zoning. So we have enterprises there allowed to run a commercial store. We have a business park where we're actually allowed to do light manufacturing, light industrial. We have a retreat, a school, and all those things have special land use jurisdiction. So this isn't something that just grew overnight. I mean, Nitai started the school in a chicken coop, and there was no master plan, and people just built what they wanted to. But then at some point, the county came in and said, "Wait a minute, you guys aren't an organized camp anymore. What are you?" And that was when the first master plan had to happen. And Anandi worked on that, and Jyotish worked on it, and a number of people in the county blocked it because they weren't really in favor of what these hippies were doing out there on the ridge. And it just grew from there. But it's something that Ananda has had somebody. It's been a major part of somebody's job since 1976. So Jaya did it for a while. Michael Gornick did it for a while. I've been doing it for quite a while. Karen Gamma was in there. And even when we wanted to say build a new building at the school, it's a non-residential building. It's governed by something called a use permit. You have to go through a whole application and a public hearing process. And non-residential buildings are especially have a lot more regulations, because you're supposed to be in a certain kind of zoning, and can you do it? And you have to have much better fire protection. Oh, actually, that is one other one I forgot to mention on the infrastructure. And that's going to be more and more important here as California burns down. So fire protection there are regulations about this. And if you build something other than a single family dwelling, you're going to have some kind of a fire protection. And that usually means a couple of things. One, you have to meet fire codes. That's a given. And the building codes now, if you're on something called the wildland urban interface. So unless you're in the middle of a city, like if you're out somewhere in a rural area, chances are in California it can burn. And you're going to be in what's called the wildland urban interface. And you're going to have special regulations about how you build, siding on the houses, size of timbers. You have to have triple pane windows. One of the windows safety glass. All houses now have to have sprinklers in them. That does nothing for wildland fire. That was a coup by the fire industry, who packed the building code convention and got it through, and it's terrible. But anyway, you have to have fire sprinklers in all residential construction in California now. And it gives you 5 to 7 minutes to get out of the house, but does nothing for a wildland fire. Anyway, sorry, enough of my pet peeve on that one. But you have to meet these fire codes. The other thing you have to do, though, is have access has to be of a certain standard. So if you have a single family, or a single parcel, you can build a 12-foot road. If you have more than that, they're going to want a fire safe road, which is a 20-foot road. So you can imagine 12 feet versus 20 is a lot different in expenses. And so, you're going to have to see what are the regulations with that. There has to be turnarounds for fire engines. There has to be places they can come in, and you have to be able to store water. And that's applied in a lot of different ways. It's, again, something on the jurisdiction. For a while, Ananda Village was retired to store so much water per house. And we could put it in these tanks that weren't hooked to our water system. And they were just these tanks that had to be buried underground. And this is something that happened in 1990. In order for us to take our next step, Jaya said, all right, you guys have to put in water storage. You don't have any. And so he found all these used tanks, and they were gasoline tanks that were getting sold off, and we put them around the village. Fortunately, in this master plan, we found something in the regulations that allowed rural areas that don't have a reliable water purveyor to meet a different standard. And we actually convinced our local fire marshal that we should meet this other standard. And he was good with it. So we just have to have a certain amount stored in our central tanks that are dedicated to fire. And then there has to be a hydrant within a certain distance of each house. So again, it depends what you build, where you are, what jurisdiction, but you're probably going to want to have access roads. You're going to have access roads that meet it, building codes that meet it. You're going to have fire clearing around. There's a certain area of cleared space, and you're going to have some water stored. And chances are, if it was just a farm before or something like that, they won't have had to have that in place. And so it's yet another infrastructure cost. So anyway, I was back at the village. I got off on that tangent somehow. But basically, we continued to have to update all these planning things. And like I said, the general plan changed, which was a big coup for Jaya and Karen. They got that through. We had a supervisor who didn't like all our neighbors, and the neighbors were all against us having more density. But the neighbor, the supervisor just said, oh, the heck with you guys. Put in one dwelling per 3 acres. This is actually more than we had asked for. So we got this in there, and the neighbors tried to take it out at least 5 different times, and they didn't succeed. And so we were able to get to the point of doing a master plan. So once you do a master plan, California environmental law kicks in. And so because we wanted to build non-residential stuff, we wanted to build a bunch of residential things, we were this planned development, we had to go through a big process of, it's called CEQA, California Environmental Quality Act. You have to look at what impact your project is going to have on the environment. There's like 20 different categories, and typically every subdivision has to go through this. So there's ways you can get around it. Maybe you're not a subdivision, maybe you're somewhere else. If you do have to go through it, it can be an expensive thing. An environmental impact report typically has to be done by a consultant, and the consultant, you don't get to choose the consultant. The planning department awards the contract and you pay for it. So the village, there's something called a mitigated negative declaration. So we said, we really don't want to do an environmental impact report. So we're going to do as many of these studies as we can, and we're going to do them as much as we can ourselves. And we'll hire people that work with us. And, we had some expertise, and we did 3 different water studies, most of which we authored with the help of a consultant. So we did a lot of the legwork. We did a lot of the tests. We helped craft the plan, and we found an engineer, and we found a hydrologist who was willing to work with us. And, they steered us too, and they put their opinion in there, but we didn't pay them nearly what you would have paid to just say, hey, we need a water study. It's $50,000, boom. So we did it, paying ourselves minimum wage or less. And then we found people who were willing to help us with it. So we did this with just about every area of study. We would always find a way we could do it. We could fudge it. We could get somebody in who would help us. We found an angle, and we actually succeeded in getting a mitigated negative declaration, which was for a permission to build 100 more houses on this land was almost unheard of. And I mean, there's part of it was we were all a single owner development. We convinced people that we were doing really good things in clustering development, that we weren't trying to make a buck. This wasn't a subdivider from outside who was going to run away. We had 30 years experience, or no, 40, 45, 40 years when we started experience with the county. They knew us, and we actually got it through. The downside of that is it took us many years. I mean, we started this push on this latest master plan in earnest probably in about 2010. And it turns out we actually did have to do a general plan amendment because we were bringing in land that was part of the Lovinger Ranch, and we were taking out land that we sold to the Polacheks. And so we had to go through that first, and then we had to do all these studies. And even after we submitted it, it took another 2 years to process it because they came back to us and said, "Oh, well, you need to do this study. Oh, you haven't looked at this and this." I mean, they said, "Oh, you have a gold mine. Our records say there's an open pit gold. There's an open gold mine on your. There's an old mine shaft on your parcel. You have to do a study to prove that this mine shaft is safe." I said, "Well, we've lived here for 45 years. We haven't found any mine shafts. Do we have to do the study?" "Yes, you have to do the study." So we found an engineer who kind of laughed it off and said, "Yeah, well, let's just walk around and, we'll look at where this is. And yeah, all the gold's over there. It's not over here." And he wrote us up this report. It cost us $2,000. And we checked off that it was called the Joe Blow Mine, if you can believe it. This was the mine. So the Joe Blow Mine is located on your property. And they had these GPS coordinates of where the mine was. I said, "Well, how did you get GPS coordinates?" And so we started doing this tracing back of where this information came from. And it turns out somebody had just, there was some study way back, like, from the turn of the century that had listed this mine, and it was in this general area. And then somebody had decided, "Oh, this must be it." And they had assigned coordinates to it, and it ended up on our land. And there it was. So anyway, in the end, we did 36 different studies to get through all this stuff. And we had transportation, we had lots of water, we had oak mitigation, we had wetland mitigation, we had endangered species, we had fire.
And were they all $2,000 each?
No, a lot of them we were able to get in there a little cheaper. Sometimes it was like we did our own kind of traffic study, and we just submitted it, and they said, "Oh, okay, yeah, I guess that's good enough," because we did some research. And so, I mean, some of them were, if you have to pay a consultant, usually they want somebody else's stamp on it. And so, I don't know, I'd say about half of them we had to pay a consultant, and it was, 500, couple thousand, 5,000. Yeah. So
it sounds like building from nothing could be millions.
Yeah. So what we came to, what Jaya has frequently said, if we had to create this community today, like even if we had the 700 acres and we had the general plan, it would take, the infrastructure alone would be millions. I mean, to get permissions to do it, to get that master plan in there, to do the studies, to put the roads in, just to put the water system in. I mean, our water system grew up, we put in pipes and we do it here, and sometimes we know where they are and sometimes not. And, if you had to put in a whole water system that we have here, it's a lot of money. So I think the real way a rural community is going to happen is you have to keep it pretty small. Like you have to keep it on 60, 70 acres. You don't really want to be dealing with so much land, and it may have to be smaller. Maybe you have to have some other ones of those, but you don't want to spread out as much as at the village. I mean, the more spread out you are, the more expensive it is. And I would really highly recommend, even if you have some land, is really cluster the dwellings and build some kind of a more co-housing model. In this master plan, we're getting buildings closer together than they were during the 70s and the 80s, just because in Ranakek cluster was the first cluster they built after the fire. Houses are, they're a couple 100 feet apart or 300 feet apart. And we just said, okay, we're going to build one in between here, in between here, in between here, in between here, because all the infrastructure is already in there. And we actually tried to make it a lot closer together. And some of the long-term residents of the village just said, we really like our space. We really like our rural things. Let's, you can go build a cluster over there that's denser, but, don't put a lot of houses in right next to mine because I like my view. And, people have entrenched interests and we sort of went that way. But it's the more you can cluster, the less expensive and the less impact on your land too. So that's important.
Now,
So go ahead.
the thing that you brought up towards the beginning of the conversation, you said that all the houses are owned by the village. The people are paying for the houses, but the people don't own the houses.
Yeah. So let me tell you a little bit about what happened with Ananda Village housing, and it's a pretty unique system, and it's not. There's some pluses and minuses, and I'll get into some other possibilities. So, what Ananda did is, Swami said, we want to keep the land cooperatively. I want to keep control of the land as a collective, but people had to bring money to build houses, and so initially people would bring the money and put up a teepee or a trailer, or if they had a windfall, they built a house. They owned that house not on paper because they had no title, they had no deed to it because they didn't own any land. But in our minds, they owned the house. And then that person would sell it to somebody else. And either they were leaving the community and they would sell it, or they were changing houses and they would sell that one to somebody else. And people were moving up, they'd sell their teepee to get a trailer, and et cetera. The sums of money were fairly small. But pretty quickly, once we got to the point of a master plan and we had to start building to code, the sums of money went up. They went up a fair amount. You're not talking about a $500 teepee. You're now talking about a $20,000 house or something like that. So it was a little bit harder to keep that system going because when people wanted to leave, they just wanted to leave and they didn't want to be arguing about their price or who was going to buy it. And obviously the only person you could sell it to was somebody who was already approved for residency in the community. And so it got, it worked okay. It got a little unwieldy. But even at that point, the village controlled the selling price of the house. So it wasn't a market. Like at one point, there were no houses and, people would have paid a lot. But we said, no, okay, what did you pay for this house? This is what you put into it. You put this much labor, this many materials. And now building costs have gone up a little bit of inflation. Okay, we were valuing your house at this. And that's what you could sell it for. So the village stepped in and regulated even that individual to individual market. So by the time we got into the 80s, that had some drawbacks. People were building bigger houses, more people were coming, more people were going. And we started moving to something that was the current system, which was more a housing pool. So the village actually stepped in and said, when you leave, we will pay out what your house is worth. Again, we still control what the house is worth. It's based on what you put into it. Then with some inflation for building costs and some depreciation over time. So it didn't keep up with new construction because it's obviously an aging structure. This is all a pretty loosey-goosey thing. This is not, you put it in your computer and a value comes out. So not that many houses changed hands until we got to the point of the lawsuits and Chapter 11, and then there's a bunch of people left. And at that point, we had to really, for Chapter 11, we had to really define who had what value, how much was it, exactly what the debt was to the person, how would they get paid out. And that's when we created this master housing agreement. So the way that works is people put in money to a housing pool and they can get that money paid back to them in a certain way that's stipulated in the agreement. And that agreement says if they choose to cash out, they can get a 5% down and the rest of it paid out in a maximum of 15 years. And then there's an interest rate set with it. So it basically turns into a payable loan as they're paid out. So what we ran into at the time of Chapter 11 was a lot of people wanted to get out at once. And it was very hard for the village to come up with those resources to pay people out. So they did pay people out, but we also negotiated payouts at that point. And then everybody that came after that said, okay, I'm abiding by this. We're gonna, the minimum I'll get down is 5%, and I'll get paid out in a maximum of 15 years. Sometimes we pay people out faster, more money comes in. We'll say, hey, it's to our advantage. Let's get these people off the books. Let's let them get them out of there. And again, that price is set when you build a house or when you don't put money in the housing pool. We sign an agreement. This is the valuation of your investment, your contribution to the housing pool. So if you built a house, it's based on the price of the house, and that can include, what you paid a contractor, what you put in yourself. We ask for receipts. We look for, all right, did you actually put in sweat equity painting your own house? Okay, we're going to value your labor. You're not a professional painting. We're going to value it at $13 an hour. We'll put that in here. We also looked at how it fits in with the overall value, because every year we appreciate the housing pool, because generally building costs have been going up much faster than what they're appreciating, and it costs a lot more to build a new house than what the old one. So we felt it, we needed to appreciate that. And again, we take in depreciation into account, because you can't keep appreciating forever if the asset that you've built is going to fall down at some point. So it's a balancing act, but everybody's contribution goes up the same amount. So typically we'll look at what the building cost index is for the year, what the inflation is for the year, and what the cost of new housing is. And it's generally been 1 or 2% a year that we inflate. So somebody put in $50,000 in 1990 to build a house. That investment is now worth a lot more. And if somebody comes in and wants to try to vest for a house in the village, we charge them that higher rate. They don't come in for what it was built for. So this has worked pretty well, except right now we've gotten into a place where building costs have really skyrocketed. And it's partly materials, it's partly labor, but it's a lot of it's to do with the codes that we have to build to a standard that just costs a lot more money than it costs to build back then. I mean, those houses are grandfathered in, but these new houses. So we're actually thinking a lot about how to deal with the housing pool right now. And we've stopped taking investment for existing houses because basically they're really undervalued. And so to say, somebody would come in and say, yeah, I'd really like to get this house. I mean, I can build a house and it'll cost me $300,000, or I can invest for one that you guys have on the books for $150,000, and I'll probably get more house for the $150,000. So we're trying to, again, look at how do we value new money coming in. And it's an ongoing process. It's been a lot of discussion. We haven't really come to a clear thing. What we're probably going to do is that money coming in isn't going to buy. We're going to inflate the value of houses to what it would more or less to what new money would come in to be able to build at, but we're not going to let people cash out that much. So we're sort of playing both ends, but we can't suddenly value everybody's housing pool contribution up to a building cost, because it just creates a huge liability for the community, and those houses are also going to come down at some point. So there's a lot of esoterica to this. I'm happy to share with people our master housing agreement, such as it is. It's actually served us very well up till now. People can move around in the housing pool. So I put in money. I lived in one house. Then I wanted to move to another house. I didn't have to sell that house. I just took my investment with me. And I forgot that part of the thing. So, okay. So one is how you get in and out. The other thing is what happens when you're there. So you get a rent credit. So you put in money to the housing pool, and there's a factor, 0.0049 per month is what it is currently. That means for every $100,000 I have in the housing pool, I get a rent credit of $490 a month. Well, we also set the rent on a $100,000 house with the same thing. So it's $490. So it means if you put in $100,000, you built the whole house, you don't pay rent. But say I only put in $50,000 and I live in a $100,000 house, I can get a credit for my $50,000, $245, and I can pay rent at $245. So it makes it really flexible for people moving this vestment around. And some people are partially vested, some people are fully vested for a house and they move to a smaller house. We actually pass through some money back to them. People move away temporarily from the community. We'll pass through some money back to them. They can get a pass through on that rent credit. but they don't have to rent the house. They don't have to be steward of the house. They don't have to decide who's in there. So the village sort of became the middleman in all this. And likewise, when somebody wanted to leave, we just say, okay, we'll cash you out, 5% down, rest over 15 years. And they didn't have to worry about selling it to anyone. So it's served us very well, except that we're in this little bit of a disequilibrium. The other piece that's made it work really well is that Swamiji in the mid 80s put in something that said, as you move in the Sevaka order, as you become a life member in the Sevaka order, we would like you to donate. You should donate your interest in. You should donate your affairs to the village. You're a full in. You're committed. That included donating your value in the housing pool. So at that point, a lot of people, to become life members, actually donated their interest in the housing pool. So they still lived there. They could still move around. We still gave them a rent credit, but they couldn't cash it out anymore. And at some point later on, toward the late 90s, we realized that that may not be the right thing for everybody, and that we no longer make it a condition of life membership that you have to donate your interest in housing, although it is highly encouraged. Because so many founding members have donated their interest in housing, and some of them have passed on, some of them are living in other places, like Asha and David have a donated investment. They don't receive anything from it, and we're able to have somebody else live in that house, collect rent on it, help keep up the houses with that. Some people have gone to the astral plane. They've left their houses to Ananda, donated. That's helped make it work, because again, if you had a liability to pay everybody out at the end of 100 years, the house that you built probably isn't going to be worth what that payout is. And so, there's a few disequilibriums in the system, but that's the current system at the Ananda Village. I also have to tell you, go ahead, you have the question.
Yeah, I was going to say, so is there a situation where people just come in there and they're just like paying rent? They come in with zero money, and they're just maybe living in some type of a situation where they're just paying rent? Or is everybody that's living there has to come in with a certain minimum amount of money?
No, we were in a very fortunate situation. Back in the early 70s, 80s, if you wanted a house, you had to manifest it. The village hadn't built any housing. There was no housing that was free and clear of somebody's investment. Somebody was there. So gradually, though, as the other communities started and people who had investments at the village moved to those other communities, we started having more housing. And the village built a few houses, very few. I mean, sometimes we've borrowed some money and built some houses, and we rented, but we were in a very fortunate situation for probably from the late 90s up until about 5 years ago, where there actually was rental housing at the village. And you could come in, and first people lived in Chandi, which was a place for new members. And it was a group house, and they could live there usually for a year. But then often, even after that, something would open up in the community. People were moving around enough, they could get a place to live, they could go in somewhere. That really hasn't been the case for the last, maybe it's been more than 5 years. I mean, we've been full, and there's a lot of people who have started renting in the area. So part of this was we had built out the old master plan. We still didn't have the old one approved, and we still hadn't been building any new houses. So right now there's probably at least 25 people who are renting in properties around the village who would love to live at the village, but there just really isn't a place for them. And we don't really have, people can build now if people can bring the money to build, but it's quite expensive. But there are a fair number of people who do not have any money in the housing pool. I'd say, right, it's probably about 30% have no money in, and another 25 or 30% maybe are not fully vested. Maybe not that many, maybe 20% are partially vested, and then the rest are people who have a full investment in there. But the houses were built by people bringing money. The village has built very, very little itself. And, we built a duplex recently where we borrowed the money and then we built the house, we designed the house, we built the house, we're going to rent the house. But unfortunately, the rents that were in keeping with what the village economy could support were not really enough to pay the mortgage. I mean, not to pay what we borrowed. We borrowed at pretty favorable rates. We borrowed at 3 and 4%. But, it's just the way our system has worked and the way rents have been and what was reasonable and what people could afford on a minimum wage economy. And so it's been hard. It's going to be hard for us to build houses. We could borrow money, but it's hard to find people that can pay the rent on a house that we could build right now. It's a real conundrum. We're looking for cheap ways to build. We've been looking for all kinds of different building systems. We're doing a manufactured home right now. There's one under construction. Gloria Ramirez, Frank knows, she decided to go with a manufactured home, and we say, okay, can that get the price down where it's more affordable? We've tried that a couple places before, but it's a real conundrum.
Does anyone else have a question for Atman? We're a little over time here already.
Oh, sorry.
No, that's quite all right. No, sometimes we've gone a lot longer, but I just wanted to make sure people had a chance for questions to be asked or comments or thank yous or whatever. Jennifer.
Yeah,
I have a two-part thing, a comment and a question. First, Atman, my comment is, I am so grateful for Ananda in my life and everything I received through that, and hearing the diligence that you and others went through, the years and the effort and the challenges. I am just eternally grateful. Thank you. And then my question would be, is there any optimism or encouragement? I'm kind of trying hard to find that in what you're saying, because it seems like such an overwhelming task. And I'm sure you have something in there that you can share with us that's encouraging.
Well, the one thing that's been encouraging to me is that, I mean, part of my job is making the finances work at Ananda Village. And I can get way down in there about this can't possibly work. And oh my God, we got this, we got that. But then you go up to a higher level, and Divine Mother has given us what we need at the time we need it. And the thing that I hold the most hope for, or that I have to remind myself, is this is a rich country. People have resources, and people right now are coming to the point of, I don't really want to live this way anymore. And, if people can sell a few houses in one place, or if they, come with some resources there, it's not out of reach. It's just, Palo Alto bought that farm in Half Moon Bay, and it's paid off. And when they told me how much they were paying, I just went, oh my God, how can you possibly buy a farm from that? But they did it. They had people were there. The money came in. They were able to do it, and they've got a farm, and it's paid off. So I think you just have to say, if Divine Mother wants this to happen, they're going to show you a way to do it. And so don't get too bogged down on, old school guys like me who have been, scraping for every penny. Just visualize this massive abundance coming, and just be clear about who's putting it in, under what circumstances they're putting it in. Because that's the other thing. Swamiji, there were times Swami people offered him a fair amount of money, and he just said, I don't feel it's right. Divine Mother didn't tell me that, you're right for this community, or that I want to be, beholden to that donor. So, you have to balance those two things, but the resources are out there. So that's my hope.
It's also worth noting that all of this long, laborious process had 50 years for it to happen in. And so we don't have to do it all. Everything that's happened at the village doesn't have to be done before we buy the land or before we build the first house or whatever that is. And it's just a wonderful thing to have the story shared with us, so we get realistic and know what it would be, but still know that there's time. Divine Mother's the master of time, and so we'll have time.
One of the biggest hopes, I mean, where's Ananda Communities? Where have they gone since Ananda Village? They've gone to, urban communities with apartment complexes. And, that is an option. But, there's Laurelwood, which was another rural, already built community. But again, it was, okay, did they have the people? Did they have the base? Did that, to make that happen? And, it's hard. I mean, there was a huge bite there. And, okay, what did it take to renovate that? What did it take to get people there? And so it's a trade-off. One of the things I would see the best would be a piece of land that has maybe one or two, some kind of dwellings on it, some infrastructure that you can find a way to expand. And, maybe you're adding more rooms onto the house and you've got a sort of a group house there. And then you can, there's things you can do, like even in Nevada County, if you have something for zone for 10 acres, you can have one house of any size. You can have a second house, because there's affordable housing is a huge deal in California. And they've tried to change regulations and zoning to try to get people to build some more affordable housing. So right now in rural Nevada County, you can build a second dwelling unit or a granny unit. That house can be up to 1,300 square feet. Then you can build a guest house, which doesn't have a full kitchen, but it has a little wet bar. Then you can build a garage and you can build a studio. And, occasionally somebody might live in that studio, but they don't know that. And they don't necessarily see that. And then maybe you have another 10 acres here where you can do that all over again. Or you can have agricultural workers housing that, if you have some kind of agriculture, there are stipulations about you can build housing that agricultural workers can come and live in. And again, if you can, steer things to get going, then maybe at some point you can shift the legal stuff that there's enough support. So it's incremental and it's being creative, but starting with something other than raw land is a huge step up to get something going. To start with raw land, especially if there's not much infrastructure out there and you got to get building permits right off the bat and all that, that's a little harder to do. So.
Well, thank you so much, Atman. It's been wonderful to hear how challenging this is going to be for us. And but at the same time to know it's been done. And we have Camino Island as the model. We have the farm, the other farm, the Palo Alto farm. We have these other situations and we'll no doubt come up with something completely different that allows us to have housing and still live in nature and have a rural environment.
And you can always, one of the things that there's another community that lives in the next county from us, and they have a central amount of land they own together, but this is the Fellowship of Friends. They've done mostly communal things there. They don't have very many residential things there. They don't have much permission for residential, but they've managed to get a good, thriving community by people buying land in the area. They have lots of people own other parcels. Those parcels have put up secondary dwelling units, they put up apartments, they rent to people. And so it's like the Assisi model too. It doesn't, ideally everything can be all in one place, but nothing says it has to be. You can be in the area and have various different pieces, and then maybe have a group central place that's this big house or something like that. So,
that's even beginning to happen at Camino Island. Too. People are moving around the periphery with their own places. Okay, all, thank you so much for joining us tonight.